My friends, and welcome back to the What If Project podcast. My name is Glenn Siepert. I'm your host, and this is episode number 155. And I hope you're sitting down, or at least near a seatbelt, so you can buckle up for the ride that we're about to go on together, because today we are talking to the one and the only Bart Ehrman about all different sorts of things. No teasers. You're going to have to listen to the episode to find out what kind of grounds we're going to explore together. But this is a good one, so I'm glad that you're here. If this is your first time here, a special welcome to you. I'm so glad that you're here. You might be wondering, what is this place? Who is this guy? What is this podcast? Where am I? What is going on? Really simple. The What If Project explores the question, what if? What if? There are ways of thinking about God and faith and spirituality and the Bible and heaven and hell and Jesus and the cross and the church and theologies and doctrines and all the things that are different than the ways in which our traditions have handed us. We call this the lifeboat, out in the middle of the questions and doubts that are likely rushing over your mind. So if you're in a place where you're deconstructing, you're rethinking, your faith is shifting, it's evolving, it's changing, this is your lifeboat. This is a place to dry off, to get warm, to ask questions, to feel your doubts, to experience no shame, no judgment, no Bible bashing, nothing like that. You are home, you're amongst friends, you're amongst family, and you are welcome just as you are. Special music today is from my friend Forrest Clay. If you haven't heard of Forrest, you're missing out. So head over to iTunes, head over to Spotify, search his name, download his music, and you'll be in for a treat. He's got a brand new album coming out soon. We don't have an exact release date yet, but keep going back to your music platforms of choice. Search his name. His songs will pop up, and there's a couple new songs from the album in this episode, and we're excited to share them with you. So all of that to say, my friends, again, this is episode number 155, and it's my conversation with the one and the only, the GOAT, the greatest of all time, Bart Ehrman. Enjoy.
Deconstructed these walls and I found a business where the company line was the only way to get paid. We built a church uncertainty that fears everything against it, where the refugee suffers and the white man has.
Everybody, welcome back to the podcast. This is the episode you have been waiting for, because today we're talking to the legendary Bart Ehrman to chat about all sorts of exciting things. And so, Bart, my friend, welcome to the podcast. It's an honor to talk to you.
I hope I'm not legendary the way, like Moses is.
You're up there. You're almost there.
I really do exist.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on here. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, well, thanks. Thanks for having me. Yeah, this is great.
You're very welcome. So, truth be told, I have a bazillion questions for you, and I have a whole shelf of Bart Ehrman books that are highlighted, dog-eared, sticky notes, all the things. But I'm going to do my best to keep my questions at least somewhat focused on your book, Lost Christianities, because I really want to pick your brain about the diversity of early Christianity. But before we get into all of that, for our listeners who maybe aren't as obsessed with your work as I am, talk to us a little bit about who you are, what you do, a little bit of your journey.
Right. So I'm a professor at UNC Chapel Hill. I teach in the Department of Religious Studies. I've been here since taught here since 1988. I started teaching at Rutgers at 1984, and so I've been teaching my courses, which are mainly on New Testament and early Christianity, for well over 30 years now. And so my expertise is on my PhD is actually in New Testament studies, but a lot of my research these days is more on second and third century Christianity. And so my expertise spans from Jesus up to the Emperor Constantine, basically. And I approach all of this from a historical point of view, not from a religious point of view. So not a devotional point of view, but from more of a historical and literary point of view.
Sure, sure. So, personal question for you. How do you identify today in regards to faith? Because I hate labels, but I hear some people
No, no,
insist
yeah.
that you're an atheist. Some people insist you're agnostic. Your Twitter bio kind of throws us all for a loop and says agnostic atheist. So, maybe clear up some of the discrepancy. What are some of your personal thoughts about the idea of God?
No, so I started out as a very strong evangelical
Mhm.
Christian. I was a fundamentalist. I went to Moody Bible Institute after high school, and I was really
As
in.
fundamental as you can get, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, but then, I when I went to graduate school and started studying this stuff pretty seriously, I decided the Bible was not inerrant, and but I remained a Christian for a very long time. It was about 25 years ago or so. I don't know when I left Christianity altogether.
Mhm.
I consider myself a humanist in positive terms because I'm a big fan of the human race, parts of it,
Parts
with
of
the
your
potential of it
most
anyway.
of it.
In terms of the negatives, I consider myself both an atheist and an agnostic.
Mhm.
When I left the faith, I had the view that almost everybody seems to have, which is that those are two degrees of the same thing, right? That you
Mhm.
got some people who don't believe in God, but they're too wimpy to say so, and so they
Right.
call themselves agnostic to kind of cover their bases. And
Right.
people who are really arrogant who say, "I know there's no God," no, they're atheists. And so, like, and now I don't see it that way. Um, I think agnosticism is a statement about what you know about the
Mm.
world. And if somebody were to ask me, do you know that there's not a superior being in charge of this whole thing? I said, no, how would I know?
Right.
I'm a peon like everyone else. But if you ask me, do I believe that there's a superior God, like somebody who's like involved with this world? I say, no, absolutely not. I don't believe that.
Yeah.
So I think atheism is about belief and agnosticism is about knowledge. And I do try
Mm.
to keep those two things distinct.
That makes sense. Was that a gradual move for you? Was it did it happen was it a quick decision for you? Was it something that happened over time?
To leave the faith, you mean,
Yeah, to
altogether?
like leave from evangelicalism to where you are
No,
now?
no, it's a very long process because
Gotcha.
I had as a fundamentalist Christian, I was convinced that the Bible had no mistakes of any kind whatsoever, and I
Yep.
could reconcile anything. There's people can if they want to, and so
Right.
I could do that. I was pretty good at that.
Sure.
But I finally got convinced that there actually, there are mistakes in the Bible. Once I
Mhm.
realized that, I moved toward a more liberal form of Christianity, which I still thought the Bible was God speaking to people, and
Mhm.
that Christ was still representative of God. And it wasn't really until, as I was saying, 25, it might have been 30 years ago now, 25 years ago, where I said, I just got to a point where I didn't believe that there's a God who's in control of this world. I mean, look around. I mean, really, with all the suffering in this world, it's just unbelievable how much suffering there is. And I just thought, it's nice for me to say that God answers my prayers, like, oh, I got the job, or oh, I got the parking space, it's like,
Right.
oh, God, thank you, God. It's
Right,
like
right.
someone else just got killed in a car wreck, and
Yeah.
let alone the 8 children who just died of starvation,
Yeah.
minute after minute, day after for many many millennia.
Sure.
So I just got, I just don't believe it anymore, and so that's
Yeah.
why I left the faith.
So your book, Lost Christianities, right off the bat, I'm going to tell you that in seminary, my seminary, which was a very evangelical school, certainly the more conservative side of theology, your work was outlawed, right? Like it's off limits. It's not acceptable. I was told to stay away from it. But once I began deconstructing, like rethinking my faith, kind of towards the end of my seminary career, I went out and, of course, did everything they told me not to do. And I started by buying a whole lot of your books and your textbooks, which are very expensive, but I found them cheap. I found them used, which is
Uh,
helpful. But
yes,
as I
yes.
make my way through your books, what continues to fascinate me is the diversity that seems to have existed within early Christianity, the beliefs, the theology, the different texts, and your work really magnifies that. Because for me, that's like a totally new idea. When I picked up your book and I saw lost Christianities, plural, I immediately thought to myself, wait a minute, like there's more than one. I thought there's only one because I
Yeah,
was brought up, probably like you, evangelical,
yeah,
to think that, Orthodox Christianity was handed to Jesus in the manger. He then gave it to the apostles, to the
yeah,
bishops, to the priests, to the pastors, and everybody else is wrong. And so
yeah, yeah, yeah.
maybe you could kick off the discussion and talk to us about like the glaring problems with thinking about history in that context and maybe a little bit about the diversity that existed back when this all began.
Yeah. So no, it's I know that's definitely what I thought too. And in fact, it wasn't just that there was only one, there was an Orthodox Christianity. The Orthodox Christianity was my Christianity. And
Right.
so like if you were a Roman Catholic, sorry, you're not a Christian, forget
Don't
the faith
mess with my
Orthodox.
Christianity, right?
Mormons, oh my God, no, you're not Christian. What are you thinking? And
Yeah.
so like so it's, and I've known people who've said, uh, you cannot be saved unless you're baptized in my church, not
Mm,
my denomination, my church.
yes,
It's like,
right.
whoa, okay.
My
So,
building right here.
so the reality is that Christianity today is remarkably diverse.
Mm,
You get Roman Catholics and Greek Orthodox and Mormons, Jehovah's
mm,
Witnesses and Presbyterians, Episcopalians and Methodists. You get all this, and they believe very different things, and they have
mm,
very different practices. But part of the point of this book, Lost Christianities, is that the wide diversity today pales in comparison with what it was in the second and third centuries,
mm,
before we had creeds, or before you had like uh, an organization of the church that was where you had leaders who were making sure everything was going the same way, and you're like,
mm,
and even when they had the leaders making sure they were going the same way, they didn't go the same way, but at least they brought a lot of the diversity under control.
mm,
And so the book is about how you have these different groups of early Christians, all of whom thought that they were true followers of Jesus, who thought that they had the truth,
mhm,
who had writings by apostles that showed they had the truth,
mm,
and they were all at odds with each other. People claim Christian, and people calling themselves Christian, who said all sorts of things that today most Christians would say that ain't Christian. But we had people saying that there were two gods, like literally the Old Testament God was different from the New Testament God, not just kind of different, but no, really a different God.
mm,
That the New Testament God was to save you from the Old Testament God, or people who said that there were 36 gods or
mm,
365 gods, or people who would say Christ was he was God on earth. So since he was God, he wasn't really human. Or
mm.
no, he was a human and he wasn't really God. Or people like just almost any doctrine you can think of, people had different views of, often contradictory views, and they all claim to be followers of Jesus. And so you say, well, why didn't they just read the New Testament and figure it out?
Right.
The reason is there
It's right
wasn't a
there
New
in black
Testament.
and white, right?
The New Testament emerged out of these conflicts. And so that's what
Yeah.
my book is about, is how the New Testament emerged out of these conflicts so that people could say, yeah, this is what it means to be Christian.
So if there's all these different branches, all these different camps in early Christianity, how did the Orthodox camp become the strongest one? Because even like for myself, I mean, when I started to start exploring things, I got some messages like in my Facebook Messenger from concerned, professors and fellow students that, you're straying from Orthodox Christianity was the big word that was thrown at me. So like, how did that become so strong? And
Yeah.
all these other ones got pushed to the side.
Yeah, well, it's a long story, and it's a complicated story.
Hmm.
But the deal is let me put it like so. The view that you outlined, that Jesus got this in the cradle and passed it on to his disciples and passed it down to the leaders of the churches. That view has been prominent for a very very long time.
Hmm.
It was most effectively set forth by the father of church history, Eusebius, in the early 4th century, who wrote a 10-volume book called The History of the Church, or sometimes called the Ecclesiastical History, where he explained, look, Christianity's always been one thing. Jesus held it, apostles held it, the leaders of the churches held it. Every now and then, some person would come along and mess it up. They'd be arrogant, or they'd be sinful, or they'd be inspired by the devil, and they'd come up with some crazy idea, and they'd get a bunch of followers, and they'd say they were the original form. But in fact, they were always an offshoot. They were a minor offshoot. And so orthodoxy was understood always to be, by Eusebius, to be primary, is first,
Mm,
and it was always the majority view. So that when Eusebius talks about these various heretical groups, the
mhm,
heretics are always secondary and corrupters of the truth, secondary
mm.
corrupters of the truth. And so the idea is you got this big thing, orthodoxy goes all the way back. Then you get these offshoots every now and then. They're pestiferous and sometimes a pain in the neck, but they're not really Christian. And so Eusebius wrote that, and after that, just about everybody agreed. Yeah, that's how it happened. And
Mm,
so it was that way until the early 20th century, when scholars started realizing that, in fact, every time you discover a new document from early Christianity, like a document that claims to be a Christian document, it has views that are not what you find in Orthodox Christianity. And it isn't just like one or two. It's like every time you find one of these documents, it's something else. It's like, well, why aren't you finding things that are like, I mean, and so they came to the view that, in fact, in different parts of the Roman Empire, where you had Christianity, in different parts, you had different kinds of Christianity in the second and third century. And so now scholars, of course, trace it back to the first century, the diversity, to the time of the New Testament. And so that's the view now, is that you have all these things. And so your question, sorry about that, that's the background.
Right,
so,
sure.
Right?
It needs background. It's a big question.
So the question is, well, how did orthodoxy succeed?
Yeah.
Why this one? So the person, if people listening to this are interested, the book that really made the big difference was written in 1934 by a guy named Walter Bauer, Bauer, and it's called Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity. And he showed this. He showed that in Antioch, it was a different kind of Christianity than in Egypt, as far back as you can trace it. Asia Minor had different kinds of Christianity. Rome had a different, and he showed this. And he argued that the form of Christianity that ended up succeeding in establishing itself as orthodox, meaning that it had the right view. Orthodoxy literally means the right view. He argued that the group that did that had the right view was the group located in Rome. Rome was the largest church in the empire. It was the largest city in the empire. It also had the largest church in the empire. They had more money than any other church. They had administrative know-how that had been trickled down from the administration of Rome. And they began asserting their influence already in the first century. And they used their money and their know-how and their influence to spread their form of Christianity, to make sure the right bishop was elected, to make sure that the bishop had the right views. And so it's kind of like, when you're choosing justices for the Supreme Court, right? You choose the ones who got your views, because that's the right view. And then you do that enough, and pretty soon you got the Supreme Court.
Right, pack it.
Pack it.
Yeah.
So they pack the church.
Talk to us about, like, where does the term like Gnostic fit into all of that? Like, how big was that in the arena that we're talking about? Because as I've been reading your stuff, Elaine Pagels, Karen King, David Brackey, like, everybody seems to talk about the Gnostics and Gnosticism in a different way. Like, some people seem to say it was a big camp and underneath were like different branches. Other people say it was a small branch amongst other smaller branches. I think it's maybe Karen King who says just get rid of the term Gnostic altogether. Somebody's saying that. So, like, maybe help us have a little bit of clarity around where that discussion fits in.
Yeah, right. It's a complicated business.
Yeah.
So the term Gnostic literally means somebody who knows. So it comes from the same word agnostic comes from, and agnostic doesn't know, and a Gnostic does know. And so there were a group of religions that emphasized the importance of secret knowledge for salvation. Some of these groups are not even Christian groups. Jesus doesn't figure into them, but a lot of them, the ones we know about, most of them are Christian, where Christ is the one who reveals this secret knowledge. And the secret knowledge in most of these systems tends to be knowledge that can help you understand yourself. As one church father put it, it's knowledge about who you are, where you came from, how you got here, and how you can return. And so the idea is that some of us have a spark of divinity within us, and it's trapped here in this world of matter. And the goal of existence is to allow the spark within us to escape our bodily entrapment. And a person can do that when they figure out that they really are a spark within, how they got into the side of them and how they can get out of here. Christ is the one who reveals the knowledge. These Gnostic groups, in order to explain how it happened, come up with a large set of myths that are describing how the world how the divine realm came into existence, how originally there's like one divine being, but it has emanations that come off of him, and then they become their own divine beings, and you have a bunch of divine beings, and this world is a catastrophe because it's created by an evil divine being, and not by the God of, not the good God of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is actually an evil divinity, or an ignorant divinity. And so all these the different groups, these different Gnostic groups, have different myths, and they have different numbers of gods, and they have different understandings of things. And so that's the debate you're referring to, is that you've got this wide range of things. And so Gnosticism today tends to get used as this umbrella term for a lot of these groups, but some scholars think the umbrella is too big to do any good. I mean, a big umbrella is nice, but if it's a city block, you can't hold it up.
Right.
So it's not going to do you any good.
Right.
And so get rid of the umbrella. And so, and other scholars say, no, what we need to do is we're going to pick like one of these groups that is really like hardcore, exactly what I'm talking about. That's the group we'll call Gnostic, and we'll call these other groups other things. Or so there's a lot of debates about that. But there's not much debate about the fact that you have these groups that emphasize the importance of knowledge for salvation, and that they involve these mythologies.
Now, when you talk about how they believe there was the spark, I think you said there was a spark inside of some people. Did they believe that like everybody had that spark, and that everybody had forgotten it, and the people who received the knowledge would be the ones who awakened? Or was it only some people had that divine spark?
So different groups, different Gnostic groups, had different views about this, as with most things.
Shocker.
Yeah, that's a shock. Yeah. One of the more important Christian Gnostic groups thought that there are three kinds of human being. There are some human beings who are just pure animal. There's nothing inside. Like my next door neighbor.
we all have this.
There ain't anything there. There are other people who don't have a spark inside, but they have faith, and they do good works, and when they die, they will be given some modicum of a good afterlife. But there are other people who have the spark within. And those who have the spark within are the Gnostics, the one who have the capability of knowing. And so being able to learn the truth isn't just a matter of smarts. It's really kind of like a predestination idea. The idea that, you either got the spirit or you don't. You got the spark or you don't. Yeah. And those people are the ones who can come to the truth. And that's why these are secret teachings, because the teachings are for those who are capable of understanding them. And so if you object to these teachings, it's because you don't understand them, which means you don't have a spark within, which means there's no way to argue with these people. Because if you disagree with them, you're not Gnostic. You don't know.
Yeah. So then those people were not able to obtain salvation then?
Not ultimate salvation, but they could have faith in good works. And so in other words, regular Christian church folk, they'd be okay they'd have a good afterlife. But for this one group of Gnostics.
Gotcha.
But other people are just destroyed. Like, you swatted that mosquito yesterday, and the mosquito didn't have an afterlife. It's just dead.
Right, it's just gone.
So it's like my next door neighbor. Swatted, that's it. Sorry.
That's it. That's the end. So let's talk about a little bit about the scriptures. I want to ask you in a moment about the Gnostic text, but before we get there, a little bit about the Bible that we have. Again, like you, probably I was taught that the Protestant Bible is the authoritative word of God. It's infallible, it's inerrant, all these things. And in my journey of discovery, like you had said earlier, like I discovered that the Bible wasn't just dropped out of the clouds. It didn't just come from the hand of God, but it went through this very complicated process of a lot of different people, a lot of different opinions, power, politics, all the different things. So can you maybe give us like a bird's eye view of how exactly the Protestant Bible that we have came to be? Maybe some things about the process that like the average listener who grew up like you and I did maybe wouldn't fully grasp.
No, I can do that. Really, the book Lost Christianities started out being a book about how we got the canon of Scripture. That's how it kind of started. That was my idea. But then I thought, no, I got to tell the story about all these Christianities.
Right.
Because the reason we have the New Testament we have is precisely because of these battles over what would be true Christianity. And so in the first century, so say the first 70 or 90 years after Jesus' death, there were obviously most people couldn't read or write, but some could, and some Christians could, and Christians wrote books. I mean, they wrote, we have the New Testament has 27 books in it, but there were other books written by Christians at the time. And because Christianity was being spread throughout the Roman world, there's no mass communication. There's no way really to, like, I mean, if you've got some views that have developed in the city of Ephesus and somebody's off in Rome, they're probably developing different views and you'll never even communicate with them, or you might, some visitor might come from Antioch and say, oh my God, that's not what we think, but so people in these different places are writing stuff and they're hearing stories about Jesus, they're writing accounts of Jesus, and they're writing books telling people how to behave and if they're going to be a Christian and what it means to be a Christian and how do you become, and they all have all these different views. So at first, that was okay because nobody knew that you have all these books out there. They just got the ones in their community. They live in Antioch. Well, these are the books. And so, but as Christianity grows, people are traveling and the books will be moved around. And you start realizing, wait a second, this is very different. And so it comes to a point where Christians from the beginning thought that the Jewish Bible was their Bible. They had a Bible to start with. They had however they defined the Jewish Bible, but they started thinking, there are these different views of things, and we need authorities for knowing what the right thing is, because you just can't pick something. You got to have an authority. And these books then started appearing that had the names of apostles on them, because the disciples of Jesus and Paul, who later converted, those would be the authorities. And so you start getting all these gospels, for example, and you get a gospel about of Jesus' sayings allegedly written by Thomas. Or his brother Thomas, actually, and then a gospel about Jesus as a young boy, also by Thomas, and a gospel by Philip, and a gospel by James, Jesus' brother, and a gospel by, you start going, you got a gospel of Peter, you got a gospel of Mary, you get these gospels, and people are saying, well, look, these are all saying different things. What are we? And so people had to decide what the authorities were going to be. And in different parts of the church, there would be different authorities. As the church grew and it began to realize it had to more or less centralize. It had to centralize. It couldn't be 5,000 things. It had to be a thing. And so unlike all the other religions in the ancient world, including Judaism, Christianity developed the idea that it was a worldwide phenomenon. So there were other religions. Like people worship Zeus everywhere in the empire. But there was no kind of official Zeus worship anywhere. The worship of Zeus in Ephesus was very different from the worship of Zeus in Rome. It was different from Alexandria. And they didn't try to coordinate it because they had no reason to. But the Christians insisted that you had to believe the right things or you won't be saved. There were no religions that taught that before Christianity. It was never about belief. But with Christianity, it's about believing that Christ is the Son of God, that he was raised from the dead, and that, you have these beliefs, and you've got to get the right ones. So people then had arguments about which books were the inspired scriptures. And while they were having those arguments, they were arguing about what the right things to believe are. And different groups had more power than others. And eventually one of the groups took over, and they're the ones who ended up deciding. So just quickly, in terms of a timeline, the first instance that we have anybody who lists Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the four gospels is a church father named Irenaeus, who's writing in the year 185. So it's 100 years after these things were in circulation. And even then, there are lots of other people who disagreed with him. The first time anyone came up with our list of 27 books, the first time on record, is in the writings of a church father named Athanasius, the bishop of Alexandria, Egypt. Is a letter that he wrote to his churches under his jurisdiction in the year 367. Wow. That's the first time anybody listened to our books. It's the books that because before that there were lists, but sometimes they'd leave things off, they add things in, and no, these are the 27. And even then it wasn't decided, but pretty soon there never was, by the way, there never was a church council that voted on it. Some people think it was decided at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325. No, they didn't even talk about it there. And it wasn't decided in any kind of worldwide church council. the first time the Worldwide Council talked about which books were definitely scripture was in the 16th century.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's not at all what I was taught.
It's not what we were taught.
No, not even a little bit.
It's in the history books. I can tell you. I'm not making this one up.
Yeah. So then how did, like, you think of the Gospel of Thomas, you mentioned that, right? And there's other, that's not really a Gnostic text, so to speak, but some say it is, but I don't know what you think. But like, what about like a text like that, even ones that aren't like super far out there, because there are some Gnostic texts that are really crazy, like you had said, but like what made that, like, those books unacceptable to be included in the canon? Like, why were those demonized, so to speak?
So when the group that became Orthodox
Mhm.
was making its decision, so in my writings, I probably do this in Lost Christianities. I call the group that later became the right belief. I call them proto-Orthodox.
Mhm.
So Orthodoxy isn't like the only thing in town now, but it's like there's a group that believes it and holds to it.
Mhm.
The proto-Orthodox, when they were deciding which books are going to be in, is it going to be the Gospel of John? How about the Gospel of Thomas? How about Peter? They're deciding. They basically they don't ever articulate it quite like this, but basically they've got 4 criteria they're looking at.
Mhm.
And when you see their discussions, it's pretty clear. These are the 4 things that matter to them. A book had to be old by their standards. It had to be ancient. It couldn't be even if somebody wrote a really good gospel last week. I mean, even Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. No, I'm sorry, it's not going to get in. It's not going to be there. It's got to be go all the way back.
Yeah.
It has to be apostolically authorized. So it has to be written by one of Jesus' own apostles or by somebody commissioned by one of Jesus' apostles. Mm-hmm. So Matthew and John, they're disciples, they're in. Mark is Peter's buddy. Luke is Paul's buddy, they're in. And so they've got to be written by apostles. So they got to be ancient, they got to be apostolic. They have to be, scholars would call it Catholic, not in the sense of Roman Catholic, but the term Catholic means universal. What I mean by that is that they get used everywhere in Orthodox Christianity. So they're not just a local favorite. Mm-hmm. They've got to have widespread approbation. And fourth, and I think most importantly, they've got to be Orthodox. They've got to toe the theological line. And if they're teaching things that we don't agree with, then it's not scripture. Right. And that was actually a criterion for deciding whether an apostle wrote it. Mm. If a book disagrees with my theology, then obviously it was not written by an apostle, because the apostle possibly be. And so a book like the Gospel of Peter was excluded because Peter could not have written this. Yeah. Or Thomas could not have written this.
Yeah, that gets a little hairy then for the second one you talked about, it being written by an apostle, with like some of the letters attributed to Paul, right? Because for a while, I guess it was assumed that they were written by Paul, but now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of more serious scholars would say like 1st and 2nd Timothy, for instance, is probably not written by him, even though it has his name on it.
Yeah. So a later book, I deal with that a little bit in Lost Christianities. A later book I wrote was called Forged. Mm-hmm. And it's about that phenomenon, about people writing books. It's mainly about early Christian books, writing books claiming to be Peter when you're not Peter. Right. You write a gospel and claim to be Peter, you're not Peter. And so what I argue in my book actually is contrary to what a lot of people think. A lot of people think that was an acceptable practice in the ancient world, and there weren't copyright laws, and it wasn't illegal. And so people, they have no problem with doing that. And
like if I went and wrote a book and said, I'm Bart Ehrman and I'm writing this book.
Yeah. Well, people say, oh, look, there's no copyright. So if you want to claim to be Paul, that's fine. Right. You're just saying that you represent Paul's views. That's okay. Yeah. Well, what about somebody else who represents the opposite views and writes a book claiming to be Paul? Do they think that's all right?
Right.
So in my book, I wrote a very big book about this, a scholarly book that I'm not recommending to anybody. It's over 600 pages, where I show that actually in the ancient world it was not that way. They obviously didn't call these things forgeries because they weren't speaking in English, but the Greek words they used for these words were pretty nasty. They call books like that. They call lies pseudo, or they call them bastards. With the connotation of bastard, illegitimate children with the negative connotation, because they don't really belong to the blood's parent. Yeah. And so they said nasty things, and nobody approved of it. And so but you get that in the New Testament. Is the issue. Yeah. So you get 6 letters of Paul that scholars have long thought probably 6 of the 13 probably
Mhm.
were not written by Paul. First and Second Timothy, as you mentioned, but all other books in the New Testament, First and Second Peter, almost certain they weren't written by Peter, and
Mhm.
so my book tries to show that. So it was a phenomenon, not just among the Gnostics, but also among the proto-Orthodox.
Yeah, I think I mean, that was a huge thing for me because once I realized that, like, a lot of the things that I thought Paul said, that were so important, once I realized that, oh, maybe Paul didn't say it, but maybe even one of his followers did, but maybe they were trying to, lessen some of this stuff that Paul had said about, like, the inclusivity of, God's kingdom and things like that. Like, maybe it just changed everything for me once I realized that Paul didn't necessarily say all these things about women, all these things
Well, no,
about,
it's a big
the
deal. I mean, with
yeah.
the women thing, I mean, the idea that women have to be silent and be submissive to their husbands and don't ask at home, don't talk in church. That's
Right.
First Timothy, which Paul didn't write.
Yeah, so changes the game. So last question for you. A lot of our listeners came out of the same background as we did. Many have commented on your work and have talked about how it's like a rabbit hole of information, and it can just feel very overwhelming. I think once you realize how kind of narrow of a view you were given of church history and Christianity and the Bible, things like that. So my question is, what advice do you have for the person out there who really wants to dig into this stuff? They have a whole bunch of sources kind of at their fingertips, but don't really know exactly where to start. What's your advice for that person?
Is this person I'm thinking of now? Is this somebody who's still a person of faith, or is this somebody who's left the faith, or is it both?
Yeah, I would say they're still in the faith, like our listeners. So there, a lot of them
Yeah,
are still they're hanging on to their faith.
yeah,
They're not
yeah,
sure what they believe, but they
yeah.
realize that I was handed something that's not really true.
So yeah, well, I have a lot of advice because I've thought about this for a long time. But one thing I'd say is people should follow the truth wherever it leads them,
Hmm.
and you should not be afraid of the truth. I mean, when I was doing this, when I was going through this transition, it was a very long, painful transition. It was for me, it was emotionally very painful because my whole life was wrapped up in my faith and my relationships and my ideas and my thoughts and my ideology, my worldview is all like wrapped up. And so like to leave, it was like, oh my God, what's going to happen now?
Yeah.
Um, and so, but I was comforted by a thought that I don't know if it goes back to Augustine, but Augustine says it at some point that if something is true, it comes from God.
Yeah.
I mean, all truth is God's truth. And
Hmm.
so, like, if if you believe something that's true, you're not opposing God here, I mean, because it's true. And
Right.
so the thing is to search for the truth.
Hmm.
Um, but I would say that you shouldn't. That I don't think anybody. I'll put it like this. I teach a class on the New Testament, and I teach this kind of stuff in my New Testament class. And most of my students are grew up in the conservative churches in the South, and so, but like, I do not want them to like dump their faith after like a semester hearing some guy talk. I mean, this is a big issue, like if I can persuade you by talking for a semester, I mean, you weren't thinking very much. You need to
Right.
think about this.
Right.
And so don't go too easily because that's not good either. And
Yeah.
so I really suggest that people dig into it and look at both sides of every issue and consider the evidence and see what seems to be the most persuasive.
Mm.
It's really difficult now. In some ways, the internet has made it far more difficult because, of course, anybody can say anything on the internet, and so anybody seems to be an expert.
Mm.
And so, how do you know? Like, how do you know? I mean, I have this problem with all sorts of areas that I'm not an expert in. I want to become an expert, and I want to learn about something, but who do I trust?
Right.
And and so because you read all sorts of stuff, and so basically, what I think is that the value of printed books with reputable publishers
Mhm.